What's the most awkward favor someone has ever called in? You're going on a double date with a vineyard heir, my cousin Veronica announced, throwing a dress at me. Or I tell Grandma about your dad's bankruptcy. She explained how Gabriel Moreau, an heir to Moreau Vineyards, asked her out but only does double dates. Just entertain his friend Liam. He's some bartender or sommelier or whatever. Well, given the threat, I had no choice but to go through with it. And thank God I did. On the first date, Veronica was practically sweating from excitement to land her future breadwinner. The two guys arrived late, but it didn't matter. With faces that handsome, they could arrive next week and you wouldn't get mad. Veronica's date, Gabriel, had perfectly styled hair and a Rolex that made her swoon. My date, Liam, had tired eyes and a cute smile. Sorry, just got back from a wine auction in Napa, Gabriel said, adjusting his designer jacket. Veronica's eyes went wide. Oh, how splendid. Where did you stay? Private estate, obviously. Hotels are so... He waved dismissively. Commercial. Meanwhile, Liam acted completely different from what I expected. When the wine arrived, he looked at the prices and whispered, $20 for a drop. Should we ask if they're rationing? I laughed. We ended up making up ridiculous tasting notes. Hints of bankruptcy with an aftertaste of poor choices. Veronica actually texted me from across the table. Stop laughing so loud. You're embarrassing me. I showed Liam, who raised his glass in a mock toast. The second date was at an actual Moreau Vineyard property. Gabriel gave Veronica the VIP tour while Liam showed me the employee break room. This is where the magic happens, he joked, pointing at an old coffee machine. 3-hour-old coffee and stale donuts. Living the dream, I said, but weird things kept happening. When the check came at dinner, Gabriel's card declined. Liam pulled out his wallet without missing a beat. I got it. You can Venmo me later. Gabriel drove a Porsche but mentioned it was technically Liam's, but we share everything. The third date, Liam picked me up in a crusty Corolla. Gabriel took the Porsche again, he explained. Your friend's pretty generous with your stuff, I said. Liam smiled. Well, I'm sure this is nothing for a vineyard heir. I raised an eyebrow. Right, but there are better friends to have. Like what kind? He asked. Like ones who don't mooch off you constantly. Liam grinned. I'll let him know. Veronica's dates with Gabriel were getting weird too. He kept taking her to Liam's apartment, claiming his estate was under renovation. Isn't this even remotely suspicious? I asked her. She rolled her eyes. It's called being humble. Rich people don't flaunt wealth. Jeff Bezos drives a Honda. Yeah, but he doesn't borrow his friend's apartment. You wouldn't understand, she said. You're dating the help. Well, she was ironically right about not understanding. Just not in the way she expected. The next double date confirmed everything. Liam texted us an address, one that led to a massive estate overlooking the vineyards. This can't be right, Veronica said, checking her phone 3 times. The door opened into a stunning foyer. Every bottle, every photo, every plaque engraved with Liam Moreau, owner and head vintner. Veronica laughed nervously. Okay, what game is this? Liam and Gabriel stood in front of us and explained the entire scheme. Gabriel works for me. He's the head of the marketing department. Amazing at social media. We do this every few months, Liam added. Test if people care about the person or the portfolio. You're the 4th woman to fail this quarter, Gabriel said to Veronica. Veronica flipped out, screaming, You can't just lie to people. This is an unethical violation. She was escorted out by security, still screaming about suing. Gabriel grinned at us before leaving. Enjoy your date. We stared at each other in silence before Liam broke it. You're not surprised. I shook my head. The Porsche thing was weird. Plus you actually knew about wine. He took a step forward. And you're not mad? That you lied? A little? That you exposed Veronica? Absolutely not. He smiled. Then have dinner with me. I crossed my arms. I don't date rich, spoiled guys who play games. Then I'll have to convince you. I looked around his massive foyer with all those fancy bottles and awards on display. The marble floor probably cost more than my car. I stepped back from him and put my hands on my hips. If he wanted any chance at dinner with me, it was going to be at a normal restaurant with separate checks. No fancy wine pairings or private dining rooms or any of that rich guy stuff. He nodded right away, looking actually relieved that I was even thinking about it. He suggested this taco place downtown that had plastic chairs and paper plates. I told him I'd think about it and walked out before he could say anything else. My phone was already buzzing with texts from Veronica by the time I got to my car. She was sending walls of angry messages about suing them both for emotional damage. I drove home trying to process everything that just happened. The whole thing felt like some weird dream where nothing made sense. I got into bed still wearing my dress and stared at the ceiling for hours. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a text from Liam. It was just a simple apology with no fancy words or long explanations. He wrote that the deception was wrong and he understood if I never wanted to see him again. Then he asked if we could talk sometime without any games or tricks. Something about how plain and honest it sounded made me actually consider it. I was making coffee when Veronica started blowing up my phone again. She was sending me screenshots of Gabriel at what she called his estate from their dates. She threatened to tell Grandma everything about Dad's bankruptcy if I didn't help her expose them online. I realized right then that I needed to control this story myself before she made everything worse. I picked up my phone and called Grandma before I could lose my nerve. She answered on the 3rd ring and I asked if I could come over for tea. An hour later, I was sitting in her living room with the china teacups she only used for special occasions. I took a deep breath and told her about Dad's bankruptcy myself. I explained how we'd been trying to protect her from worrying about it. Her face got sad, but she wasn't angry like I expected. She reached over and squeezed my hand and thanked me for being honest with her. She said she'd rather know the truth than be kept in the dark like a child. We talked for another hour about Dad and money and family. She told me stories about tough times when she was younger that I'd never heard before. When I left, she hugged me longer than usual and told me to bring Dad by for dinner soon. That evening, Dad called me while I was eating leftover Chinese food on my couch. His voice was tight with stress about creditors calling and payments he couldn't make next month. I felt that protective anger rise up in my chest but pushed it down. I promised to help him find resources and make a plan without just throwing money at it. He kept apologizing, and I kept telling him it was going to be okay. After we hung up, I spent 2 hours researching credit counseling services and bankruptcy lawyers. The next day, Veronica started posting cryptic Instagram stories with old photos from her dates with Gabriel. She added captions like "Big reveal coming" and "The truth always comes out" with dramatic music. My stomach dropped when I saw them getting shared by her followers. Liam texted me saying this could turn into a PR nightmare for the Vineyard. He asked if we could meet to talk about it without any drama or games. I agreed to meet him at a regular coffee shop near my apartment the next morning. He showed up in jeans and a regular t-shirt, looking tired. We sat at a corner table and he explained how the whole testing thing started. Apparently his family's vineyard had been targeted by women trying to marry into the business for years. Some had even tried to blackmail family members or leak business secrets when relationships ended. I pushed back hard on the ethics of what they'd been doing. Testing people without consent was wrong no matter what happened before. He actually listened instead of getting defensive or making excuses. He nodded and said I was right and they'd already stopped the program. I wasn't ready to just forgive everything, but I appreciated him actually hearing me out. I laid out my boundaries clearly if he wanted any chance with me. No more tests or games of any kind ever again. No VIP treatment or expensive gifts or special access to anything. Complete honesty about everything going forward with no exceptions. He agreed to all of it immediately, and suggested I could visit the vineyard during regular work hours. He wanted me to see his actual daily life without any staging or showing off. I told him I'd think about it and we went our separate ways. 3 days later, I decided to take him up on the vineyard visit. I showed up during a busy morning shift and found him in dirty work clothes checking fermentation equipment. His hair was messy and he had grease stains on his shirt. He was completely focused on some technical problem with one of the tanks. A valve had broken and wine was slowly leaking onto the concrete floor. He was on his knees with tools spread around him trying to fix it himself. While he worked on the crisis, I wandered over to where some hourly workers were taking a break. They seemed surprised to see me but were friendly enough when I introduced myself. One older guy mentioned that Liam regularly worked right alongside them during harvest season. He said the boss got his hands just as dirty as everyone else when things got busy. Another worker laughed and said Liam had helped her move apartments last month using his own truck. They all seemed to genuinely like him despite him being the owner. It was weird seeing this different side of him after all the deception. I headed to the break room for water when Gabriel walked in behind me and closed the door softly. He stood there shifting his weight from foot to foot while I filled my cup at the cooler. His face looked different without the fake rich guy act, more tired and stressed. He cleared his throat twice before starting to talk about the whole scheme. He explained how the marketing numbers kept dropping and investors were breathing down his neck about engagement rates. His hands moved nervously as he talked about quarterly reports and social media metrics and conversion rates. I could see sweat forming on his forehead even though the room was cool. He said the fake dating tests seemed like a creative solution to boost the brand's story appeal. The words came out fast like he'd been practicing them in his head for days. I watched him pace back and forth in the small space between the coffee machine and the microwave. When he finally stopped talking, I just nodded and told him I understood pressure even if I didn't agree with the methods. He looked relieved and left quickly, almost tripping over a chair on his way out. My phone rang while I was walking back to my car and Grandma's name appeared on the screen. She told me Veronica had called her crying about some vineyard scandal and trying to make me look bad. Grandma said she shut it down immediately and told Veronica to handle her own problems like an adult. Her voice sounded tired and disappointed when she talked about the family drama this was creating. She mentioned how she'd hoped we cousins would support each other as adults instead of fighting like children. I could hear her moving dishes around in her kitchen while we talked, her usual stress response. She asked if I was okay, and I assured her everything was fine on my end. After we hung up, I sat in my car for a few minutes processing the family mess. That evening, I was scrolling through Instagram when Veronica's story popped up with dramatic black text on a red background. She'd posted about preparing an expose on wealthy men who play games with women's hearts for sport. The post already had dozens of views and several comments from her friends offering support. My stomach tightened as I watched the view count climb higher every time I refreshed. She followed up with another story hinting at names and dates and evidence she was gathering. I screenshot everything and sent it to Liam with a message about potential problems ahead. Within an hour, my phone lit up with an unknown number that turned out to be Margot Lindberg. She introduced herself as the Vineyard's PR director in a professional voice that sounded practiced but not fake. She explained she was reaching out to anyone mentioned in Veronica's post to offer support and coordinate responses. She asked if I wanted to provide a statement to get ahead of any story that might develop. I told her I wasn't interested in being part of any PR campaign, but appreciated her reaching out. She said she understood completely, and gave me her direct number in case anything changed. The next morning, another unknown number called while I was making coffee. Penelope Jarvis introduced herself as the Vineyard's legal advisor, and asked if we could discuss the situation. She explained the tricky balance between defamation risks if Veronica lied versus PR problems if she told the truth. Her voice stayed calm and measured as she outlined different scenarios and potential outcomes. She said there was no perfect solution, just different levels of damage control depending on how things played out. She mentioned they could send a cease and desist, but that might make things worse. I thanked her for the information and said I'd think about my options. Later that day, Liam texted asking if we could talk in person about everything that had happened. We met at a park near my apartment where kids were playing on swings and dogs were running around. He started defensive when I brought up consent and power dynamics in his testing scheme. His jaw tightened and he crossed his arms while I explained why deceiving people were harmful. I kept my voice steady and laid out how trust can't exist when one person holds all the information. Slowly, his posture relaxed and he uncrossed his arms as he actually listened to my points. He admitted he'd never thought about it from the women's perspective before, only about protecting himself. We sat on that bench for over an hour going back and forth about ethics and honesty. By the end, he was nodding and saying I was right about the problems with his approach. We were walking back to our cars when he mentioned the Vineyard was planning a community open house. My phone buzzed right then with a call from an aggressive voice asking for my dad by name. The creditor had somehow gotten my number and was demanding payment for overdue accounts immediately. My chest got hot with protective anger as I told them they had the wrong number. After hanging up, I realized Dad's financial problems were worse than he'd been letting on. I called him that evening and heard the exhaustion in his voice when he answered. I told him about the creditor call and offered to help him find legitimate resources. He resisted at first, saying he could handle it himself like he always had. I pushed gently and sent him links to nonprofit credit counseling services while we talked. He finally agreed to look into it after I explained how they could negotiate with creditors. The next day, I went with him to meet with a counselor at a small office downtown. The counselor was patient and non-judgmental as she reviewed Dad's finances and created a plan. Dad signed up for a debt management program that would consolidate his payments into something manageable. Walking out, I saw his shoulders were straighter than they'd been in months. A week later, Liam texted about the Vineyard's open house happening that weekend. He asked if I was comfortable attending given everything with Veronica and the publicity concerns. I appreciated him checking instead of just assuming I'd be there as his date or whatever. I decided to go but drove myself and planned to leave if things got weird. The event was bigger than I expected with tents and tables set up across the lawn. Local wine clubs and community members wandered around tasting samples and touring the facilities. Everything seemed normal until a woman from a wine club approached Liam near the main tent. She spoke loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear as she confronted him about the dating tests. She called them disrespectful to women and demanded to know how many people he'd deceived. The crowd around us went quiet as people turned to watch the confrontation unfold. Liam's face went red, but he didn't try to deflect or make excuses this time. He publicly admitted the testing program was wrong and promised to review all company policies going forward. Gabriel pulled me aside near the grape sorting tables while Liam handled more questions from the crowd. His usual smooth confidence looked cracked as he glanced around to make sure nobody was listening. He explained that investors had been breathing down his neck about engagement metrics for months, and the pressure to show growth was insane. The board wanted viral moments and shareable content that would boost the brand's social media presence. He admitted he'd pushed the whole testing scheme harder than he should have because quarterly reports were coming up. His hands shook slightly as he showed me angry emails from investors threatening to pull funding if numbers didn't improve. I could see genuine stress in his eyes for the first time since I'd met him. He apologized for using me and Veronica as props in his metrics game. Part of me wanted to stay mad, but I recognized that pressure from people who control your paycheck. Still kept my distance though because trust takes time to rebuild after games like that. 20 minutes later, commotion erupted near the main entrance as Veronica pushed through the crowd with her phone held high. She was live streaming and narrating loudly about exposing the truth behind rich men's lies and manipulation. Security moved in smoothly without touching her while asking her to lower her voice and respect other guests. She spun around dramatically, claiming they were trying to silence her and suppress the truth about what happened. Other guests started pulling out their phones to record the scene as she got louder and more theatrical. One woman near me was already posting a clip to her Instagram story with confused captions about drama at the Vineyard. Security maintained their calm, professional stance while gently guiding Veronica toward the exit without any physical contact. She kept filming and shouting about lawsuits and media exposure as they walked her to the parking area. Someone's partial video went viral within hours, showing just the part where security surrounded her without the context. 3 days later, Penelope called me about the legal situation with Veronica's continued posts and threats. She'd sent Veronica a carefully worded notice about harassment and defamation, but warned me about making things worse. Sometimes responding to someone determined to create drama just gives them more ammunition and attention. The Streisand effect meant that trying to suppress something often made it spread faster instead. Penelope's voice stayed matter-of-fact as she explained we had to accept that some battles weren't worth fighting. The best strategy was often to let things die down naturally, rather than escalate with legal action. Veronica would probably get bored and move on to her next drama if we didn't give her reactions to feed off. I appreciated the honest advice even though part of me wanted to fight back against the lies she was spreading online. That evening, Grandma called me sounding worried about posts she'd seen on Facebook from distant relatives. Someone had shared Veronica's video and now family members were asking questions about what really happened. Grandma's voice trembled slightly as she asked if our family name was going to be dragged through mud over this. I took a deep breath and explained the whole situation honestly without trying to make myself look better. Told her about the testing scheme and how Veronica had reacted when she found out Gabriel wasn't rich. Grandma listened quietly, then said she appreciated me being straight with her, even though the situation was messy. She worried about gossip at her book club, but understood that sometimes people create their own problems. Her main concern was whether this would affect Dad's situation, or make things harder for our family. I reassured her that everything would calm down once people moved on to the next piece of gossip. The following week, Liam and I met for coffee to figure out what we were doing with whatever this was between us. We agreed that keeping things quiet made sense, but we weren't going to hide or sneak around either. No big public displays or social media posts, but also no pretending we weren't seeing each other if people asked. Both of us needed time to figure out if this could work without all the games and deception from before. He understood my need for boundaries after everything that had happened with the testing scheme. I appreciated that he didn't push for more than I was ready to give right then. We decided to just take things slow and see where they went without pressure or expectations. 2 weeks later, we met at a taco truck downtown for an actual normal date without any fancy venues. Sitting on a bench with cheap tacos, we talked about real stuff like past relationships and family expectations. He told me about the exhaustion of people seeing dollar signs before seeing him as a person. Every woman his family introduced him to had researched his net worth before the first date. He dated a woman for 6 months who dumped him when she found out the vineyard had a bad harvest year. The testing scheme started after his ex-girlfriend tried to get pregnant to trap him for child support. I found myself relating more than expected to his stories about people wanting things from you. My own experiences with family using me for money or connections felt suddenly similar even at a different scale. The next week he invited me to see the vineyard's lab where they did the actual science of winemaking. His whole demeanor changed as he showed me the equipment for testing soil composition and monitoring fermentation temperatures. He explained how different yeast strains created different flavor profiles with genuine excitement in his voice. The lab tech working there grinned and said she'd never seen him this animated about showing someone around. His competence and passion for the actual craft showed through without any wealth display or showing off. He knew every detail about the fermentation process and could explain the chemistry in simple terms. This was the real him without the games or tests, just a guy who loved making wine. Later that day, Ivy pulled me aside in the break room while I waited for Liam to finish a meeting. She'd worked at the vineyard for 15 years and wanted me to know the testing games had made employees uncomfortable too. They worried about what other deceptions might be normalized if lying to people became standard practice. The staff had started questioning whether their performance reviews were genuine or if they were being tested too. She said morale had dropped after finding out about the dating schemes because trust matters in a workplace. Several employees had started looking for other jobs because they didn't know what else might be fake. Her voice stayed professional, but I could hear real concern about the culture Liam had created with his games. The next morning, Liam called an all-staff meeting to address the concerns that had been building up. He stood in front of everyone and admitted the testing program had been wrong and created trust issues. I watched from the back as he took questions and apologized without making excuses or deflecting blame. When someone asked about preventing future deceptions, I suggested bringing in an ethics consultant to review policies. Liam immediately agreed and asked his assistant to start researching consultants that day to begin the process. The staff seemed surprised but cautiously optimistic about actual changes being implemented rather than just promises. Within a week, Quentin showed up at the vineyard for an emergency board meeting about the proposed ethics review. He cornered Liam in the hallway afterwards, saying the consultant expense was unnecessary and would make them look weak. Bringing in outsiders to review their practices would be admitting fault publicly, which could affect their reputation. He pressed Liam hard about dropping the whole thing and just handling concerns internally without outside interference. Other board members had expressed similar worries about looking like they needed supervision to run their business properly. Liam's jaw tightened as Quentin kept pushing him to abandon the reforms to maintain their image of success. The next morning, Liam called another board meeting and stood at the head of the conference table with papers in his hand, while Quentin sat there with his arms crossed, looking annoyed. Liam read from his prepared statement about ending all testing programs effective immediately and taking full responsibility for the damage these games had caused to people's trust. The other board members shifted in their seats and exchanged looks, but Liam kept reading through their obvious discomfort about admitting fault so publicly. Quentin interrupted twice, trying to suggest softer language, but Liam shut him down and finished reading the entire statement, which would go out to all staff and eventually to the media if needed. After the meeting, Liam sent the statement to every employee email and posted printed copies in the break rooms, while Quentin stormed out muttering about stock prices and reputation damage. 2 days later, Margot showed up at my apartment with a folder full of potential interview questions and strategies for keeping me out of any media coverage about the vineyard's policy changes. She sat at my kitchen table and went through different scenarios where reporters might try to contact me and how to redirect them without being rude or creating more story angles. We practiced responses for an hour with her pretending to be different types of journalists, from aggressive tabloid writers to sympathetic lifestyle bloggers who might seem friendly but still want dirt. She wrote down my phone script for declining interviews and gave me her direct cell number to forward any media contacts immediately, so she could handle them professionally. The whole time she respected my request to stay anonymous and never once suggested I should do interviews to help Liam's image, which made me trust her more. That weekend, my phone buzzed with an Instagram notification showing Veronica had posted a photo from some charity event 6 months ago, where she was standing near Gabriel and Liam in a group shot. Her caption said something vague about vineyard life and tagged the location at Moreau Estates even though she hadn't been there since getting thrown out by security weeks ago. I texted Liam the screenshot and asked if this was going to be a problem since she was clearly trying to imply she was still part of that world somehow. He called back within 5 minutes and explained the photo was from a public fundraiser where hundreds of people attended, and she'd probably grabbed it from someone else's social media, since he remembered her not even being invited to that event. He stayed calm and said Margot was already aware and monitoring, but unless Veronica made specific false claims, they would just ignore her attempts at staying relevant to their story. Monday morning, Dad called while I was getting ready for work and asked if I could loan him $800 for his car insurance and electric bill that were both overdue with shut-off notices coming. My stomach twisted with guilt, but I told him I couldn't give him money, though I would help him call the companies to work out payment plans and see what assistance programs he might qualify for. He got quiet, and I could hear the disappointment, but I explained that just giving him money wouldn't fix the real problem, and we needed to get his finances organized properly with a real plan. We spent 2 hours that evening going through all his bills and debts on a spreadsheet while I helped him prioritize what absolutely had to be paid first to keep basic services going. He kept apologizing for needing help, and I kept telling him there was no shame in struggling, but there would be problems if we didn't face it honestly and make hard choices about spending. 3 days later, Grandma called and invited both Liam and me over for tea that Saturday afternoon, with no fancy preparation, just regular tea and cookies at her kitchen table, like she did with family. When we arrived, she had her regular mismatched mugs out and store-bought cookies on a plain plate, which actually seemed to relax Liam more than any fancy setup would have. She asked him normal questions about his work and family, without any of the testing or probing that rich families usually did to evaluate potential partners for wealth and status. Liam talked about the actual winemaking process, and she asked about the science parts, which led to him explaining fermentation in simple terms, while she nodded along, genuinely interested in learning something new. The whole visit stayed casual and human with Grandma, treating him like any regular person dating her granddaughter, instead of some prize to evaluate or test for worthiness. The following week, Gabriel knocked on Liam's office door with a presentation folder and pitched a completely new marketing direction focused on telling the real stories of vineyard workers, instead of the usual luxury lifestyle content. He showed mock-ups of social media posts featuring the lab technicians who test soil, and the harvest crews who pick grapes at dawn, and the maintenance team who keep the equipment running year-round. His whole energy felt different as he explained how authentic engagement came from showing the real people and work behind the wine instead of staged perfect moments that felt fake. Liam approved the new direction immediately, and Gabriel started scheduling photo shoots with actual employees who seemed excited to have their work recognized instead of hidden behind glossy marketing. A week after that, the wine industry publication ran Liam's interview, where he talked openly about ending the testing program and taking responsibility for the harm it caused to trust and relationships. The comment section split between people praising his honesty and growth versus others calling him out for thinking manipulation was ever acceptable in the first place, regardless of his reasons. We read through them together and agreed that redemption wasn't going to be instant or universal, but at least he was trying to do better going forward, which was all anyone could really do. Then a blogger picked up the story and mentioned me by name as, quote, the woman who changed vineyard dating culture, unquote, which made my chest tight with anxiety about becoming some kind of symbol or story that wasn't mine to control. Instead of panicking alone, I called Liam and told him how uncomfortable the attention made me, and we spent an hour talking through my fears about privacy and becoming part of his public narrative without my consent. He suggested we write out clear boundaries about our relationship, including rules about photos and social media and public events, so we both knew exactly what was okay and what wasn't. I spent that evening drafting a document with specific terms about keeping our dating private for now and limiting spending to normal activities and never posting about each other online without explicit permission first. Liam read through all 3 pages seriously and signed it without arguing about any points, which showed he actually understood why I needed these boundaries after everything that had happened with the games. That weekend, he texted that he'd canceled a helicopter tour he'd booked for our next date and suggested a picnic at a regular park instead with sandwiches from a normal deli, not some fancy catered spread. We sat on a basic blanket eating regular food and talking about movies and books without any wealth display or expensive surprises, which felt more romantic than any helicopter ever could have. 3 weeks later, harvest season hit and everything changed overnight. Liam started leaving my texts on read for hours, and when he finally called back, his voice sounded dead tired from working since 4 in the morning. The vineyard needed every pair of hands picking grapes before the weather turned, and he was out there with the crews loading bins and checking sugar levels and fixing equipment that broke every 20 minutes. I understood this was his actual job, not some game, but sitting alone in my apartment while he worked 18-hour days made me feel forgotten, even though I knew better. One night, he managed to text me a photo of himself covered in grape juice and dirt with bags under his eyes that made him look 10 years older. I drove out to the vineyard the next morning with coffee and found him yelling at a maintenance guy about a broken Destimer that was backing up the whole production line. His face was red and his hands were shaking as he pointed at the machine parts scattered everywhere. The worker looked ready to quit on the spot when Liam suddenly stopped mid-sentence and put his hand over his face. He walked straight over to the guy and apologized without making excuses or trying to explain why he was stressed. The worker nodded and they got back to fixing the machine together, while I watched from the doorway, realizing this was the first time I'd seen him lose control, and immediately try to fix it. Later that day, Penelope called to tell me Veronica's attorney had sent a demand letter asking for $50,000 in emotional damages from the dating deception. She explained they could fight it in court, but that would mean months of depositions and public records that might damage the vineyard's reputation, even if they won. Instead, she'd negotiated a settlement where both sides would take down all social media posts about the situation and sign mutual non-disclosure agreements with no admission of fault from either party. The whole thing felt gross and unsatisfying, but Penelope said sometimes the practical solution wasn't the fair one, and keeping this quiet was worth more than being right. I agreed to the terms and signed the papers, feeling like Veronica was getting away with blackmail, even though technically we were the ones who'd lied first. 2 days after the settlement, Gabriel showed up at my apartment with a laptop and a nervous smile, asking if I'd consider doing some consulting work for their new authenticity campaign. He explained they wanted to shift their whole marketing strategy to focus on the real people who made the wine, instead of the luxury lifestyle stuff that felt fake. The pay he offered was 3 times what I made at my regular job, and he promised I'd have creative control over the content. My first thought was conflict of interest since I was dating Liam, but Gabriel said they'd already figured that out, and I'd report directly to Margot instead, with a 6-month contract that ended before next harvest. I spent the weekend writing up my own terms, including strict boundaries about work hours and approval processes, and creative ownership of anything I produced. Margot reviewed everything with their legal team and agreed to all my conditions, including a kill clause if I felt uncomfortable with any assignment. My first day on the contract, I interviewed 7 employees about their daily work, and listened to them explain fermentation temperatures and pruning schedules and soil testing with genuine excitement nobody had asked them about before. The head lab tech showed me how they tested sugar levels, and the maintenance supervisor explained why certain equipment needed daily cleaning, and the harvest crew leader talked about reading the vines to know the perfect picking time. Each person lit up when they realized someone actually wanted to hear about their expertise instead of treating them like background props for lifestyle photos. We created social media posts showing the lab tech's notes about pH levels and the early morning frost checks, and the careful hand sorting of damaged grapes. The engagement numbers started climbing immediately as people commented with real questions about winemaking that the employees could answer with actual knowledge instead of marketing scripts. 3 weeks into the campaign, a journalist from Wine Spectator called asking for a comment about, quote, the vineyard that tests women for authenticity, unquote. My chest went tight, but I transferred her to Margot like we'd agreed, and tried not to think about how the story was spreading beyond our control. Margot handled it perfectly with a statement about evolving practices and lessons learned without mentioning any names or specific incidents. The article ran anyway, but focused more on industry dating culture in general than our specific situation, which felt like dodging a bullet we'd loaded ourselves. Employee surveys from that month showed morale improving across all departments, with workers feeling more valued and included in the company story. The progress was slow, and some people still resented the old testing program, but at least things were moving in the right direction instead of staying stuck. Liam and I finally sat down for a relationship check-in at a coffee shop where we agreed to date exclusively, but keep things private without any social media posts or public appearances together. We both wanted something real that belonged to us, instead of becoming content for other people to consume and judge and analyze. He promised to communicate better during busy seasons, and I promised to speak up when I felt neglected, instead of letting resentment build up silently. That same week, Dad called to say he'd successfully enrolled in a debt management program that reduced his monthly payments to something he could actually afford. The counselor had negotiated with his creditors to freeze the interest and create a 5-year plan that would clear everything if he stuck to the budget. It wasn't a magic solution, and he'd still struggle, but at least the calls would stop and he could sleep without panicking about bankruptcy court. Sunday rolled around and I drove to Grandma's house for our weekly lunch like nothing had changed. The table was set for 4 instead of 5, and nobody mentioned the missing plate. Grandma served her usual roast chicken and asked about work while Dad talked about his new budget plan. We passed dishes around and made small talk about the weather and the neighbor's new fence. The empty chair sat there between us, but we kept the conversation moving without looking at it directly. After dessert, Grandma squeezed my hand and said family was complicated, but love wasn't conditional. Monday morning, Gabriel sent out the campaign launch announcement to all vineyard staff and media contacts. The email credited 12 team members by name for their contributions, but kept me off the list like I'd asked. My phone buzzed with screenshots from employees showing their stories going viral on the vineyard's social channels. The head lab tech's post about testing sugar levels got 3,000 likes in 2 hours. Comments poured in asking real questions about fermentation that the staff answered with actual knowledge. Gabriel texted me the engagement numbers every hour, looking proud of what we'd built together. By Wednesday, the campaign had picked up coverage in 3 wine magazines without any paid promotion. The authenticity was working because it was real, not manufactured like the old lifestyle content. Thursday afternoon, Liam picked me up in his regular car for a hike at the state park nearby. We walked the trail talking about normal stuff like how he hated mushrooms on pizza and I'd never learned to swim. He told me about his childhood dog who ate an entire birthday cake once. I shared how I'd broken my arm falling off a bike at 7 and still had the scar. We stopped at the lookout point and watched hawks circle below us in the valley. He asked what movie I'd watch if I could only pick one for the rest of my life. I said probably something funny because who wants to be stuck with drama forever? The conversation stayed light and easy without any talk of money or vineyards or complicated histories. Walking back to the car, I felt something shift. Like maybe this could work if we kept it simple. That night, I scrolled through my blocked contacts and saw Veronica's name still sitting there. Part of me wanted to check if she'd tried reaching out, but I closed the app instead. Dad called to say his first reduced payment had gone through successfully, and the creditors had stopped calling. I told him I was proud of him for sticking with the program, even though it was hard. Friday, I texted Liam about grabbing tacos next week at that truck we'd talked about. He replied with 3 taco emojis and a time that worked for both of us. No fancy restaurants or elaborate plans, just 2 people getting food and seeing where things went. Life felt manageable when you stopped trying to control every outcome and just dealt with what was actually in front of you. Thanks for hanging out with me today and sticking through all my random questions. I had a good time just wondering about stuff with you. Until next time, take care. Like the video, it helps more than you think.